We're live. And no scores table intro. It's a miracle. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This is Mind Your Banners for February 27th, 2025. Sorry we were a little bit delayed. I've lost my phone and can't find it. That's never a good thing. But the good news is we are still here. He is still Mike Niziolek. Mike, how are you doing on this glorious pre-spring afternoon?
Oh, I'm great. I got a lot going on. I got to go to the West Coast tomorrow, but got the women's game tonight. Important women's game. Feels like both teams are playing for their tournament lives.
Would you say West Coast, Best Coast?
We'll see. I have not been to Seattle before.
I actually never have either. Washington State is, I think I figured this out recently. Washington State, I think, is one of only 9 states I've not visited. So
I thought you said you did Seattle for the tournament and Dayton. From Dayton?
Portland.
Oh, that's Portland. Okay.
There was a time when it looked like to get out of Portland, I was going to have to wake up at 5 a.m., rent a car, and drive to SeaTac Airport to get home.
That would have been a lovely trip to Seattle.
Because, yeah, I mean, I would have been able to cross off Washington State then. I think I would have earned my Washington. You remember those old fridge magnets?
Yeah,
Did your grandparents have those?
No,
yeah, all of them, yeah. And I would always be like, these don't fit together. These states are not the correct size. But anyway, we're not here to talk about travel concerns. We are here to talk about Indiana basketball. And in particular, I think both the present and future. We'll start with the present first. Indiana has now won 3 of its last 4 games. The Hoosiers, I think everyone knows, are obviously beat Penn State on Wednesday night. Not the prettiest game on earth, but certainly one that Indiana just kind of needed to win and move on from. I think we're starting to see Indiana really creep back into NCAA tournament projections. I looked at Bracket Matrix this morning, and it had Indiana as the last 11 seed and in 71 of 115 possible brackets. So we're really starting to see Indiana kind of surge back into that portion of the conversation. I mean, I think it's fair to say, Mike, like they've still got a lot of work to do, as every bubble team does at this time of year. If you're on the bubble by its nature, you've got work to do. But they're firmly in that mix now. I don't think there's any way around that.
Yeah, but I mean, they could get tripped up. With 3 games to play, a loss to Washington would probably be, worst case scenario. I mean, I think they could survive a loss to Oregon, but
I think they could survive a loss to Washington if they beat Oregon.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's a tougher task based on just the timing of the games as well. It's an 8:30 game. They're going to have been on the West Coast for 5 days. It'll be interesting. And then obviously with the finale against Ohio State, I still think, I mean, if you want to avoid the first 4, you probably got to win at least 2 of the last 3 here. And then that would probably help them avoid the first day of the Big Ten tournament. So it'll be interesting to see if they can carry over the momentum, because obviously, they've won 3 of 4. The last 2 second halves, the second half against Purdue and Penn State, were probably some of the best basketball they've played this season, especially offensively. What they did moving the ball around yesterday was really impressive. The problem has been kind of carry over, and now Malik Renew's status is kind of up in the air, and that kind of puts a lot of pressure on Oumar Ballo. He played a lot of minutes yesterday, and so we'll see if they can kind of, like I said, keep this going, which is something that they haven't been able to do.
We'll talk first about results, and then talk about maybe what they need out of the West Coast trip. But I think the reminder, and you did something on kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of Indiana's resume as things stand right now. The reminder you get when Indiana just sort of pins a couple really high quality wins on the board, Purdue, obviously at Michigan State, is that what's dragging this resume down is not bad losses. And that is an important feature at this time of year. Like that is an important sort of card to have in your hand. A lot of bubble teams, you mentioned several there. I think you mentioned maybe Georgia, Oklahoma, a few others. There are a lot of other teams in and around the bubble that either because they're coming from mid-major conferences or because they've just lost some games they shouldn't, are having to sort of shoulder quad 3, quad 4 losses. you said Washington would trip Indiana up, and I agree to a certain extent, but even Washington would only be a quad 2 loss. And if they did lose it, it would be their first quad 2 of the season. Never mind the fact that they can't lose unless something really catastrophic happens in Indianapolis, a quad 3 or a quad 4 game at this point in the season.
What's the road for quad?
With the road for quadrants, it goes down to, I think, 125 or 130, something like that. Washington is comfortably in quad 2. The bigger quad 3 concern was Penn State, but Penn State winning those 2 games before the Indiana game bumped Penn State back into the top 75, which is a quad 2 at home. Obviously, also keeps Penn State for the moment as a quad 1 on the road, which is important. Right. And as I predicted to you last night, Penn State actually went up in the net today because of the efficiency, I think, probably of their offensive performance in losing to Indiana. Indiana did not move in the net, but Penn State kind of shored up its position, which helps Indiana. The point is, on the one hand, if you are Indiana, you do still have work to do. On the other hand, if we live in a hypothetical world, for example, for a moment where Indiana does upset Oregon, let's say beats Washington and then upsets Oregon, then suddenly Indiana's resume takes – I guess what I'm trying to say is it's easier for Indiana to improve its resume here in the last 2 weeks in big chunks than I think it is for some other bubble teams, because those bubble teams are trying to outweigh bad losses, where Indiana's just got to add quality to a resume that really didn't get any over the non-conference schedules we talked about, and really didn't get any over the first half of the Big Ten schedule, with the sort of the exception of the Ohio State road win, which is at least quad 1. What Indiana needs now is just quality wins.
Yeah, I just don't think they need to win 2 out of 3 to sort of be comfortable. To avoid the first 4. I don't even, and I think that would help them too to sort of make the Big Ten tournament meaningless, because I mean, you don't know your draw, you don't know. The 8-9, if they got the 8-9 matchup, and that might be a rematch with Oregon. I don't know, just to try to sort of solidify their status before the tournament probably would help this team out a bit. I think
the only way Indiana is out of Dayton before it gets to Indianapolis, like for sure, is to go 3-0 down the stretch. Yeah. Personally, just because the Ohio State game, I don't think is going to be a quad 1. Like Ohio State held on against USC last night, so they bumped up to 33 from 35. They could get around 30. It's top 30 for a quad 1 win at home. It's top 75 for a quad 1 on the road. So the road win will hold up as a quad 1 road win for Indiana, which is important. 3 quad 1 road wins. Again, another thing that bubble teams don't tend to have a lot of is high quality road wins. Right now, Indiana's got 3 quad 1 wins away from home. That is very valuable when you're in Indiana's position. But the only real, I think it's likely at this point, the only quad 1 opportunity Indiana gets between now and the end of the regular season is Oregon at Oregon. And if Indiana beats Washington, it doesn't mean a ton. It's a quad 2. It's fine. If Indiana beats Oregon and loses to Ohio State, maybe that's the world where it's not terrible. But I think the other thing you'd like if you're Indiana, go back to the bracket matrix projections. Ohio State is right there as basically in these aggregations, the first team out of the field. I think the other thing you'd like if you're Indiana is to beat Ohio State so that you can claim, I understand this isn't necessarily an analytical data point the committee uses, but you can justifiably claim, here's a bubble team that we played twice and we beat twice. So, in addition to these other elements of our resume, you can be assured that we're a better team than them. I think Indiana's got to win all 3 of these to really feel like it's definitely out of Dayton, regardless of what happens in the Big Ten tournament. And then, it probably depends a little bit on who you're playing there, and maybe 1 extra win would really help you. But I think Indiana's going to be sweating the first 4 unless it goes 3-0 here down the stretch. That's my personal opinion.
Do you want to talk? You posted Hooperazzi's question up there. What would have happened if Woodson had changed his lineup, or made similar changes kind of to these rotations and lineup? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's easy to say with hindsight. there are some elements that I think it's fair to point out, like, for example, not being quite so too big heavy. On the other hand, people who are, for example, people who are calling for, who in the last few weeks been calling for more Luke Goody and less Mackenzie Mbako, I would refer them back to the fact that at the beginning of the season, Goody kind of started off on a shooting slump. He eventually got out of it, but at the time he was in a shooting slump. And Mbako was, for a while there, Indiana's most consistent source of offense. I mean, like, if you go back to even those games in Atlantis, he was bad against Louisville. Everyone was, but he had 13 points and 4 rebounds against Gonzaga, and he had 25 points against Providence. In addition to, I think, 17 points and 7 rebounds against South Carolina. Like, it's really easy to look at what's working now and say, well, what if it had worked then? But again, and I'm not criticizing Luke Goody at all. Shooters are allowed to go through slumps. But at the same time that we're talking about Mackenzie Mbako, sort of being one of the few sort of real lighthouses for this team's offense, was the same time of year when Luke Goody, I think, started 5 of 20 from behind the arc. So, it's kind of hard to say it should have been this or it should have been that. I think maybe the one area beyond the two bigs, which has just been done to death, and I don't think we need to rehash it too much, but I would be curious for your thoughts. The one big change I would be curious about is more Anthony Leal. And I don't mean that, there's a lot of people who it's like, oh, it's intangibles and this and that. And I think that's important, especially from a senior. But like, Leal didn't play in any of 6 of Indiana's first 10 games. I think he was injured for at least a couple of those. So it wasn't like that was all just coach's decision. I think he had an injury. But undeniably, I mean, he's, to use a Ken Palm statistic, over the course of the season, he's playing about 37% of available minutes. In Big Ten play alone, that number spikes up past 52%. So, like, I mean, his playing time has clearly risen as the season has gone on. And I think what has been important, number one, he's quietly been better in the assists area than I think he gets credit for. But number two, and I think this is really important, what he has done defensively has allowed Indiana to free up guards it needs to be more creative and impactful at the offensive end. Without, like Trey Galloway, for example, you think about how worn down he was by the end of last season because Indiana needed him to be its best offensive guard, but also its best defensive guard. When Leal is putting in this really hard defensive shift against a Braden Smith or an Ace Baldwin, or what he did against Michigan State, or even in some of these recent losses, it frees up somebody like Miles Rice or Trey Galloway, who finds their game on a given night, to pour more of their energy and attention into their offense and not feel like they've got to be, an elite two-way player in the same way, if that makes any sense. And I think that's, if we're talking lineup changes, again, the two big stuff, at this point, I think is pretty well established. The other one for me is I just wonder if you couldn't have found a role this size for Anthony Leal earlier in the year, because I do think it has made a real difference here down the stretch.
That would have required, though, and this maybe is like a critique or a counterpoint to like having the infinite NIL budget, that it handcuffs you from taking a chance like that until everything goes wrong. Because like, he would have had to bench a guy making a lot more money than Anthony Leal at the start of the year that you recruited and brought in.
Here's the one thing I'd be careful about. Like, are we sure he's making a lot more money?
Pretty sure.
I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if the numbers are closer than you think, but I understand what you're saying.
But some of that's self-generated too. Like, Leal's done deals on his own, like not provided by the school. So, but and perception-wise, like when you recruit, like you're recruiting the 3 top 25 players, and you're going to then bench one at the start of the season and not play him 20 minutes a game because you would have had to have a genuine competition and feel that Anthony Leal was back. That would have taken probably a level of like I said, kind of like guts that they just didn't think they needed to because they thought they had the talent. But I mean, I think it speaks to maybe the lack of if they had played maybe 1 or 2 tougher games in the non-conference schedule, they could have gone to these changes sooner because they could have seen that that the battle for Atlantis wasn't an aberration, that it was going to be sort of the standard against tougher teams. Like the two big lineups wouldn't work. They needed more sort of, to come together chemistry that they thought they'd develop, but just never came. Like, I don't know. I think maybe it's all just kind of like the perfect storm. Like they didn't learn any lessons from the non-conference schedule, rolled into the Big Ten with sort of like what they thought would work. And didn't in some of the higher profile games, and then kind of collapsed, right? In Iowa, Illinois, lost 8-10.
You want one of my hot takes?
Yes.
My hot.
But I said no. Are you done? Is that it?
Yeah. Yeah. You can't have it.
No. I don't want it.
No, and I don't know if this is that Indiana should have been as good as it was on the day and just hasn't been, or if something about that was fool's gold or what, but I that Tennessee game just feels like such a strange data point for like where Indiana wound up over the first 2 months of the season, kind of everywhere else. Because if you were Indiana, I think you had every right to come out of that game and feel like a lot of this makes sense, look at Miles Rice and Malik Reneau and the way they play together, and Umar Ballo. I was the one banging the drum for the idea that Ballo didn't need to be a double-double player, that it was just like his defense, his rebounds, his rim protection, his sort of screen and roll game. That was all Indiana needed from him because it had these other players that could do these different things. And I'm not going to act like I thought Indiana was, going to win a national title just because they won an exhibition game at Tennessee, but I wonder if it almost reinforced some things Indiana believed about itself in the preseason that for whatever reason, and there could be a number of them, for whatever reason, just turned out not to be true. Because, Indiana gets down to Atlantis, and I think the most revealing thing Mike Woodson said over that whole week was after the Louisville game when he said, I thought we were where we needed to be defensively. And not only was Indiana not where it needed to be defensively, like it was so dramatically not where it needed to be defensively, you thought, well, how could you have possibly come to that conclusion? Right. You just allowed 89 points to a Louisville team that admittedly turned out to be better than we thought they were at that time. But still, I just wonder about that Tennessee game. And not that Indiana shouldn't have played it. I think Indiana should seek more games like that in the future. But if there was just something about that game that either was fool's gold or wasn't carried over for whatever reason, that maybe because you talk about not challenging yourself enough in the non-conference, I just wonder if Indiana thought that was the challenge. It needed to learn certain lessons that obviously it didn't. I want to bring this in really quickly before I do want to talk about the coaching search as well. But Ryan Breach asks, do you think Malik Reneau will make the road trip? There has been no update on Reneau thus far today. For people who don't know, he went to apparently had to go to the ER in Bloomington last night. Mike Woodson said basically he was around for pregame shoot around, and then I think Woodson's term was he came down with something, which I don't want to fill in blanks when we're talking about medical stuff, but certainly sounds like he just got like a stomach bug or a flu or something. Just kind of developed really rapidly, maybe something viral. I think it's touch and go, frankly, because if you're Indiana, you can always fly Reneau out later if you need to. I mean, like football programs do that when a football player has to be hospitalized overnight, on the road, they fly them back or drive them back. If maybe they can't fly, like a concussion type situation, that a staffer stays with them and then gets them home. I mean, you might, and I don't want to speculate too much. Again, there has not been an update on Reneau to this point, but you might need to consider something like that if there's a concern about, putting somebody sick on an airplane with everybody else, because this would obviously be, and we've seen some teams really struggle with this year, Illinois being the prime example in the Big Ten. This would be pretty much the worst time, imaginable to come down with some team-wide illness.
Yeah, I mean that's not a hot take. That's a very true take.
Oh, no, that was not a hot take. No.
Okay. But Alex said not playing the what if game. But what I thought was interesting is that in the last two press conferences, Mike Woodson sounded a bit more wistful in terms of like made hints that like I think he said if we was asked about kind of the recent success, and he said, if a ball bounces one or two other ways, we're probably not even having some of these conversations. He's gone to that and pointed out, especially, which I talked about kind of in the resume thing, that 5-game losing streak in particular, 4 of those games were lost by 10 or less points. I think he thinks about the what ifs, and he's thinking about the what ifs because that sort of defined the season. And
he's
put it on the rails,
he has certainly ditched like a lot of his preconceived notions about like what this team should be rotations wise and things. I mean, like, it's 2 games in a row now that Indiana basically just played 6 players in the second half. I know, Carlisle and Hatton get on the floor in the second half against Penn State, whereas they don't at all against Purdue, but they play like a combined 4 minutes in the second half.
Hatton played a minute and 10 seconds. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like it is literally, right now in crunch time, 3 guards, Luke Goody, Umar Ballo, and a backup big.
Yeah,
I mean that's I did Mackenzie Mbako play? Mbako might have played a little.
He played like 11 minutes in the second half.
Yeah, so they got to. I guess they got to. Well, no, they still only played 6 because Reneau wasn't in the game. So instead of basically it was Mbako in the game in the 6-man rotation instead of Reneau. Woodson has always pared down his rotations as seasons have gone on. But I mean, this feels like a pronounced sort of. And this is what you talked about. You wrote about a little bit about it from one direction. I wrote about it from another last night. Like, this is just very clearly he's picked his guys. Like, he's just he's in and Hooperazzi.
He's defined it. He's defined it too. I mean, he's made the delineation like he's just riding the guys that mostly have seniors and most experience. 4 of those guys are seniors: Leal, Galloway, Ballo, and Goody. 3 of them are 5-year seniors. Goody's not, right? Goody's just a regular.
That's senior. Correct. Yeah.
So 3 5th-year seniors, another senior. Then Rice. He's been around college basketball for 4 years? This is 4th year.
This is his 4th year.
So I mean, that's kind of where he's drawn the line. And you mentioned Tucker, and I think that's sort of to protect him a little bit. The idea that you're just going with the guys that have been in these moments.
I don't think Bryson Tucker has done something to remove himself from the rotation. I think Woodson has just decided
because he said some guys,
there's no tomorrow for me here. I don't need to worry about I don't need to worry about next season or this guy's long-term trajectory or whatever. I just my service at this point is just to this team until this season ends, and these are the guys that I'm going with.
Yeah, and not to have to make everybody happy in every moment, and it's probably a bit freeing in that sense that if somebody's upset about the rotation, well, tough luck. But I do think there's something to be said for saying, look, it's the experience that kind of will get us over this moment. And he's not ruling out, because he's gone back to Carlisle in recent games, and he was kind of a forgotten man for a while. So I could see a spot where Tucker comes in because he is sort of offensively can kind of put points in bunches. Like if he's comes in the Oregon game, I could see that, especially if Renew's not there and they need to, open up the bench a little bit. But I just think it's that experience that sort of, especially in these second halves, to try to limit mistakes, to try to have sort of steady leadership. Because, these are high pressure moments. And if you come up short, you can't really bounce back now. So that's why I think he's kind of done it.
Should we talk about the future now?
How far into the future?
I mean, an undetermined length of time at this point. I guess this is a little bit like shameless self-promotion time, but I tried to, and I think you read it, just like take a different spin on like just producing some, hot board 2.0 that really had, no particular updates, because I don't think there are a ton of updates. I do believe the most I can provide here on my end, and chime in if you've got more, is basically I do believe Indiana's probably at the point now with turnkey involved where third parties are making contact with other third parties to feel out certain things. Would someone be interested? If they would, on what terms? What would the non-negotiables be, and so forth. But I don't, based on everything I've heard and everyone I've talked to, I don't buy the line of thought that basically it's all done and it's just being kept under wraps, and that is out there right now. I suspect that's not true. Maybe I'll be proven wrong in the long term, and I'll hold up my hand if I am. But I just tried to kind of spin it into something a little bit more analytical, like what would get Indiana to certain candidates over others. And, you know, I got to, I just come through a bunch of KenPom data, and basically I came up with two criteria that seem to be not uniform across sort of the levels of success Indiana wants to have, going to deep into the NCAA tournament, winning Big Ten titles, and then, you know, eventually building a program that is capable of you know, reaching Final Fours, maybe even winning championships. And the two big ones, I mean, the two most consistent ones were, one, the ability to either score or defend the ball at a really high level, or both, but at least one of those two, you are somewhere between great and elite, like 95th percentile or above nationally in either the ability to score the ball or defend the ball. And I looked at efficiency numbers because I was kind of ruling out style. I didn't want to say, well, only teams that play this way, or only teams that shoot the ball this way, or play at this speed, or whatever. But in terms of efficiency, score the ball at an elite level or defend the ball at an elite level, or both. And then teams that either consistently win, basically the best way to boil it down is probably consistently win the rebound game or consistently win the turnover game. Because teams that are doing one or both of those things, whether it's through a bunch of offensive rebounds, whether it's through elite defensive rebounding, whether it's through producing a bunch of turnovers, whether it's through not committing any turnovers, teams that do that control the number of possessions in a game, and therefore the tempo of a game and the opportunities in a game. And that's what led to me to, I wound up kind of sticking 5 names in there that seemed at least realistic. And we could talk about those if you want, but like, it was just kind of an attempt to sort of sift through or distill some of this in a way that was a little bit different from just kind of, you know, very mild updates on things and just moving through and recycling the same information over and over again.
Well, I mean, you want to talk about who was the guy that stood out most, or who maybe were surprised to find on that list? I mean, what was your sort of ultimate takeaways about the 5? You generated 5 names. You know, what was this? I don't know, taking whatever direction you want, like the surprise, or, you know, most.
It was funny as how much of the Big 12 was represented in the 5 names. It was TJ Otzelberger at Iowa State, Scott Drew at Baylor, Tommy Lloyd at Arizona, Mick Cronin at UCLA, and Will Wade at McNeese. And I tried to obviously push aside coaches that would seem unlikely. You know, maybe Indiana has a home run hire in its back pocket, but like John Shire fits those criteria, but obviously he's not leaving Duke. You know, Mark Few, I think, fits a lot of those, but it seems unlikely you're going to get, you know, a 62-year-old Mark Few out of Gonzaga at this point. Not that, you know, nothing's ever impossible, but I tried to go with candidates.
How many names total fit your criteria?
I didn't go like all the way down the rabbit hole, but there were probably at least 4 or 5 others that, for different reasons, whether it's because I didn't think they were attainable or I didn't think they were fits for other reasons.
Sure.
You know, I just didn't include them. And listen, I'm not suggesting every one of these coaches is attainable. Like, I mean, I think Scott Drew would be hard to get out of Baylor, for example. Tommy Lloyd's got a good thing at Arizona, you know, and he's been pretty consistently a West Coast guy. Mick Cronin, we've talked about before, has a really heavy buyout. And even if there's all the will in the world for everybody to say, hey, maybe Indiana's the better place for you, UCLA is in mountains of debt, and I just don't see how they can waive an 8-figure buyout when they desperately need money. But those were the 5 names I came up with. I don't know if there were like surprises so much as I think it's certainly like TJ Otzelberger is a good example that you look at a coach like that, and part of you, because he's only been at Iowa State 4 years, you kind of feel like, well, is this just a flavor of the month, you know, kind of coach? I mean, Archie Miller, you know, Indiana probably got a little bit burned with that, and Archie looked like a great hire. It turned out he wasn't, and I pointed out in that story that actually those criteria, Archie would not have met them. But actually, the more I dug into Otzelberger, the more I liked his profile. He's been to 5 NCAA tournaments in 8 years as a head coach. He'll make it 6 of 9 this year. you should probably give him a 7th because he won the Summit League his last year at South Dakota State and then lost in his conference tournament. But like the point is, he built a mid-major team very much capable of making the NCAA tournament. If you're willing to just kind of like forgive the 2 years at UNLV, which is I think, an increasingly difficult job for a variety of reasons, he's been kind of on a steady rise ever since he started into head coaching. And the other thing I'd forgotten, because I just don't pay as much attention to Iowa State for obvious reasons, is that, Iowa State was on the floor when he took him over. That, they hired Steve Prohm and after Fred Hoiberg left, and it really never clicked. And his last year, Prohm went 0 in the Big 12. And Otzelberger, I have this, I don't know why I want to call him Otzelberger. Otzelberger took over an Iowa State program that had gone 0-18 in the Big 12 the previous year and hadn't had a winning record in conference play in 4 years. And he immediately, they weren't great, but he immediately got them into the tournament as an 11 seed. They made the Sweet 16. The next year they were a 6 and they got bounced in the first round. And then last year they were a 2 and they got to the Sweet 16 again. So that was definitely one that I just kind of looked at and I don't know that I didn't necessarily have him on the list before. I know he was in. My initial hot board, but it definitely changed my opinion of him, basically.
Well, so everybody should read it. It's lengthy. It's got some depth to it.
Well, yeah, just set aside a few minutes. Huberazzi says the coaching pool is shallow, and I maybe I don't know if this is the best place to finish with this or not, but I don't know that I agree with that. I think it's diverse. First of all, I was actually looking for the Ohio State or the Iowa State Oklahoma State game the other night, and I realized it was being broadcast exclusively on ESPN Plus, which is a reminder that the money in college athletics is maybe going to dictate Indiana's ambitions in this hire more than it has in the past. The other thing I would say is I just think it's more, to me, like there's not an obvious slam dunk, grand slam, whatever, Hail Mary, fill in whatever. If we can assume Brad Stevens is out, there's not like a coach out there that's just like Nick Saban to Alabama from the Miami job would be the, kind of the football example. But I do think there are a handful of coaches that could either reflect like a Kurt Signetti to Indiana type hire. Ben McCollum would probably be the most obvious example there. He wasn't included in mine. Huberazzi also asked here about Todd Golden, setting aside the off-court stuff with Todd Golden. I didn't include either of them because basically their profiles look pretty promising, but Golden's not been a head coach for very long. There's not a lot there, and he's only been in a high major job for a couple of years. And I just couldn't find advanced data for Division II. I tried, and it's probably out there somewhere, but I couldn't find anything to build off of Ben McCollum's time down in Division II, where he had a lot of success. I think there are also a handful of hires that I'm not saying they will be, but I think they could be the Cal to Kentucky, Self to Illinois type, or Self to Kansas type hire. I'm not saying they guaranteed would be, but for example, TJ Otzelberger going from Iowa State to Indiana, it wouldn't be hard for you to paint me a picture of that winding up not dissimilar to, John Calipari going from Memphis to Kentucky, or again, the better ones probably.
But weren't those more established names in those points in their cares?
Let's see.
Calipari and Self were both.
I'm struggling to find Kansas's profile on KenPom right now. I know they've done some syncing lately. Self had been at Tulsa for 3 years, and then he'd done 3 years at Illinois. He never won the Big Ten. He did make the Elite Eight once, his first year there.
Yeah.
But I think Self's Illinois tenure is probably sort of remembered in a certain way because right after he leaves, Bruce Weber takes that team to the national title game. and they lose to North Carolina 2 years later, because Self leaves Illinois for Kansas in 2003. Bruce Weber takes over at Illinois, and then in 2005, he takes Illinois all the way to the national title game where they lose to North Carolina. So I think Self's Illinois tenure is maybe remembered as, I mean, he was really good, don't get me wrong. He went 27 wins, 26 wins, 25 wins, made the tournament every year, KenPom top 10 finishes every year. But I don't think it's unfair to compare him, for example, to TJ Otzelberger at a similar point in his career. Okay. And then he goes to Kansas, has about 3 good to not great years. And then he has the run where he goes Elite 8, national title, Sweet 16, round of 2, Elite 8, and really starts on that run of like they win the Big 12 every year, and they're just kind of like basically as consistent as any program in the country. I think there are more hires that you could convince me would be on that trajectory if Indiana made them. So what I'm trying to say is basically, it like I saw someone describe the NFL draft recently as a meat and potatoes draft, that it's not very deep at the top, it's not studded with stars at the top this year, but a lot of league executives feel like it's very deep. That's kind of how I feel about this coaching pool, that there aren't a lot of guys where it's like, oh my God, Indiana just, shook up the whole sport overnight. But there are a lot of guys that you could convince me would do a good to great job here, basically.
Yeah, no, I get that. And I mean, like you said, I mean, Indiana probably has the money to maybe make a splashy hire like that. But I mean, will that be what Scott Dolson sort of tries to do? And I think that's kind of the key question. Does he try to get a Seghetti type, or does he go a different direction? It'll be interesting to see kind of for basketball when you have a much stronger program to start with. How does that change your coaching search?
The thing I would say,
the top names of sport would never have considered Indiana football.
That's fair.
And so, like with Indiana basketball, you're starting at a much different spot. And so that's sort of, I think, the interesting part of it. Like maybe somebody comes out of the woodwork that you don't think, and then is like, I'd be interested, right? And then that changes the trajectory of the search. You never know.
Well, and I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking, forgive me. But that is kind of the one other thing I wanted to bring up, which is the impact of revenue sharing. Because I made that Iowa State, Oklahoma State, ESPN Plus comment sort of tongue in cheek, but sort of not. Like the thing people have to remember is for a long time, the money was going up everywhere. And every time one of the power conferences needed to re-up its TV deal, it would just go to a network and say, put 10% on whatever the last conference got. That's essentially the negotiating point. We'll sign something close to that. Boom, boom, boom. Everybody was just making more money and more money. Where we've gotten to now is we're kind of starting to scrape the bottom of the revenue barrel on the TV side because of cord cutting and other issues. So what we're having to do more is take money from some people to give to others. And that's how basically the Pac-12 died, right? Like that's essentially what killed an entire power conference that had been around for 75 years or whatever. I thought it was interesting how many Big 12 coaches wound up in that group of 5 at the end of my analysis, in part because that dynamic's not going to change anytime soon. And the other thing people need to remember is revenue sharing is not static. It's 20.5 this year, and then it's 4% more next year, which I think is going to be in the 21-something range. Then it's 4% more on top of that, compounded the year after that. Then they'll review it in year 4. But the way they got to this number is they took the average Power 4 athletics department annual revenue. They cut it in what everyone believes anyway. I don't know if anyone's ever confirmed this publicly. What everyone believes anyway is they sort of took the pro model of how the pro cuts up the TV deal and says half to the players, half to the owners, whatever. They said, here's the average annual revenue. If you cut that in half, here's how much should be shared to athletes. But then they pointed out, and I don't think unfairly, this is what the average of what these departments are already spending on scholarships. So we're going to subtract that. And that's how they got to the 20.5 number. The thing is, the average revenue for a Power 4 athletics department is probably going to keep going up. But it's going to keep going up for some at the expense of others. And what that means is the Big Ten and the SEC basically are going to make revenue sharing more expensive for everyone else because they're going to keep making more money at a faster rate than everybody else around. If you are in a Big 12 job or an ACC job, or certainly outside the Power 4 altogether, I think there is a part of you that looks at the next 3 years and says, well, my school can give me a competitive number in basketball, no problem. But what about the next 5 years? What about 8 years from now when that number, because I suspect if revenue sharing stays in the structure that we are sort of expecting to be implemented with the House settlement, we'll probably keep using a relatively pro model to calculate this quote unquote cap. So 8 years from now, what if that number is 32 or 33 or 35 million? And the Big Ten schools can fulfill it all, but I'm not sure my conference's athletics departments can, because we're not going to be making as much playoff money and we're not going to be making as much TV money. And by the way, the Big Ten and the SEC are very clearly starting to pull at the strings of things like the NCAA tournament and the college football playoff structure. And I just wonder if there aren't some coaches that are looking at Indiana and saying, that's a place that will support a winner. That's a place that's going to give more to basketball than almost anybody else. That's also a place that is probably going to be in a better financial position 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now than just about anywhere else for men's basketball outside the Big Ten and the SEC, which essentially means what? Indiana, Purdue, Kentucky, maybe a small handful of other schools, but a lot of schools are going to dump the lion's share in football. I just wonder if there's some schools that are looking at Indiana now with revenue sharing coming in, and it's not just the number they would get day one, though I think that will be robust. My understanding is Indiana is planning to essentially commit about double the Big Ten league average in terms of like overall rev share to basketball. They're going to see what that is, and they're going to double it, and that's going to be their starting point. But I think it's also maybe informing the way people are thinking, okay, but I want to do this for the next 15 years. Where is the job I'm in now going to be 7 years down the line compared to what Indiana might be in 7 years? Mark says the Indiana basketball comparison in the Premier League is Everton. I promise you, none of you are that miserable. I promise you, none of you are that despondent and broken. The best comparison, honestly, until Liverpool started winning under Jurgen Klopp, was genuinely Liverpool. Now it might be Manchester United. Anyway, I mean, forgive me, I did a lot of talking at you there about rev share, but I do think that is important because that is kind of the long game of this that I suspect some coaches, and probably more than that, some agents are going to be looking at and saying, hey, listen, this may not mean a lot to you now, but 3 to 5 years down the line, it's going to start feeling like a real separation, I think.
Well, I think that's what the talk's been. I mean, particularly, maybe it's been accelerated for football in terms of you're either in the Big Ten, the SEC, or you're not. And basically, it's, you're saying people, you're basically irrelevant if you're outside of it, that you want to be sort of in that framework because the money there, that's what, and that the talent's going to follow the money. And so, I think it's not only easier for revenue sharing, but I mean, the changing landscape of NIL, I think when you're at a school for basketball in particular, where the fair market value for basketball players is going to be higher than, pretty much anywhere else. And so, I mean, it all helps, right? It all adds up to more dollars that you can get to players to solidify, the best roster or one of the best rosters in the country. In the short term and long term. I mean, you're set up for success here. And that's kind of what we talked about when we wrote that previous long story about the job that, financially speaking, you're probably not going to find a better opportunity out there, especially, I mean, this cycle, for sure, but just in general, there's only, 2, 3, 4 jobs that so I think in basketball specifically, because football obviously a different story, but basketball that stacks up to Indiana or would be better than Indiana, the foundation that they've laid.
We'll end with these comparisons because people are starting to throw out some wild ones. First of all, I don't really want to explain to my Auburn graduate stepmother that Auburn is Everton. Everton is dysfunctional. I promise you it's not that dysfunctional. On the other hand, it's also not that successful. Mesro 99 says Auburn, like Everton, is passion plus incompetence plus moments of glory. I would like to know what moments of glory Everton has experienced having not won a trophy in the last 30 years. If you want my comparison, and you can throw this across this blanket across. I mean, like I people have said, like, what college football program, for example, is Indiana? And I've always said it's a bit of a cross between like Tennessee and Texas, where there are some obvious advantages. There's some infrastructure there that's never going to go away. There's fashion. There's a passionate fan base, a passionate fan base, a passionate
fascism in there
that will always support, sort of the ambitions of the program and of the sport within the school. But there's also at times maybe a presumed level of almost like expectation that I think, if you want the Manchester United comparison to be is apt now, is I think for, Manchester United were maybe the biggest club in world football in the 90s and 2000s. And that there has been for a while now, and maybe Manchester United is just starting to come out of it. And I certainly don't think this applies to Indiana anymore, but I think it might have at one time almost this sort of assumption that there was a birthright to success, that it was just going to come eventually, and that you just had to kind of keep waiting, be patient, and get ready to let the good times roll. I think what Indiana, and this is, I think, to his credit, what Scott Dolson has, sort of really tried to take into this search is kind of a steadfast belief in the idea that Indiana has to make its own success here, that there is no birthright to success, but that when Indiana has it, and this is why it's true of Manchester United as well, and this is why I make this the United comparison, or the Liverpool comparison pre-Klopp, when Liverpool had spent a lot of time not winning the Premier League, not consistently in the Champions League, etc. Once you start to have that success, the ceiling at a place like this is much higher than most places. If you can harness that, the passion, the expectation, the ambition, the resources, everything, and start winning at a certain level, what the fan base will do for you, what your home court will do for you, what your position in the Big Ten will do for you, all of those things, the ceiling here becomes a lot higher than it is most places. And I think that's the appeal of the job. And I will salute Mesro 99, who says he is old enough to remember Everton's Dogs of War under Howard Kendall in 1985. Mike, I know you watched those teams.
I can literally add nothing to any of this.
You've got a Gary Lineker scarf. I know you do. I know you do.
Zero.
I know that you've got a miniature Dixie Dean statue on that.
None of these words mean anything to me.
No, trust me. You do. The People's Club, born not manufactured. We'll leave it there. I think that's more than enough for today. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. Mike will be making the trip out west. Send him all your best West Coast beer recommendations. I will be covering from home and managing a 7-year-old's birthday party. So, God help us both. But until we speak again, Mike, thank you for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. This has been Mind Your Banners for February 27th, 2025. We will talk to you again soon.